On a hot August day in 1590, an English explorer named John White approached an island off the coast of Virginia in a wooden vessel called the Hopewell. White had established a colony on that island 3 years earlier, so he was very eager to check in on his people and resume his position as the colony's governor. After White landed on that island in a small rowboat, he began investigating. What he found there has become known as one of the most baffling mysteries in American history. Six years earlier, in 1584, two ships sailed across the Atlantic Ocean with a single goal. They were scouting out a location to establish the first English colony in America. The ships landed along a series of narrow islands off the coast of modern-day Virginia, known as the Outer Banks. The scouts briefly explored the territory, and they even established positive relationships with the local natives before loading up their ships and sailing back to England. A return voyage, led by an explorer named Sir Walter Raleigh, was quickly planned later that year. With a suitable location now discovered, the goal of this next trip was to establish a permanent colony in the New World. So 7 ships left England in September of 1584 with over 600 men and enough provisions to last over a year. The voyage actually went very smoothly until the lead ship approached the Outer Banks and crashed into a large stone just below the water's surface. The stone ripped a gash in the side of the wooden vessel. Water gushed into the ship's cargo hold, spoiling much of the provisions that would be needed to establish this new settlement. This lead ship was carrying most of the provisions for the entire expedition, so the size of the new colony had to be substantially reduced. Just over 100 men stepped off the boats onto a place known as Roanoke Island and began building a colony. Roanoke was an excellent location because it provided both easy access to the ocean, but it was also sheltered by another landmass that was directly in front of it, so it couldn't be spotted very easily by foreign spies who were passing by. After a month of setup, the 7 ships bid farewell to the colonists and set sail back to England. Initially, the colonists actually established great relationships like the local natives, just like the scouts before them had done. The natives were even kind enough to offer them additional provisions as the colony was under construction. But as provisions began to run low, the Europeans became more and more reliant on the natives just for their basic survival. The natives struggled to keep up with the English demands and take care of their own people at the same time, and this began to strain the relationship. Besides this, the natives began to notice strange things. Seemingly every time an Englishman would visit their village, a group of natives would collapse and die just a few days later. They began to believe that the English had this strange superpower, the ability to kill from a distance by shooting tons of tiny invisible arrows through the air. In reality, they weren't actually that far from the truth. The English were carrying diseases that the natives had never been exposed to, and it was decimating their populations. The leader of the English colony, Ralph Lane, and the local native leader named Virginia grew suspicious of each other, and they both realized that cohabitation was no longer possible. Virginia ordered his people off of Roanoke Island and established a new village on the mainland. Pushed by a hunger-fueled insanity, Lane began to believe that Virginia was forming a plot with other native tribes to attack the English community. We don't know if there was any truth to Lane's suspicions, but he decided to take drastic action before it was too late. On June 1st, 1586, Lane and the other colonists traveled to the natives' village on the mainland and slaughtered their entire population. Virginia was decapitated and his head impaled on a stick outside the English colony on Roanoke. A few weeks after the massacre, another English explorer named Francis Drake stopped in at the Outer Banks on his way back to England after a successful exploration of the Caribbean. Nearly starved to death by this point, all but 3 of the Roanoke Island colonists boarded Drake's ship and returned home to England. The 3 who remained on the island just didn't happen to be around when Drake arrived, and so they were left behind. The colony had been a catastrophic failure. Food was in short supply, no gold had been discovered, and all the local native tribes were completely alienated after that massacre. Despite the harsh reality of America, though, one of the colonists, named John White, began to grow restless after his return to England. A map maker by trade, White quickly began to miss the struggle of wilderness living and just the sheer awe of the new world. He longed to go back. After petitioning for over a year, White finally secured funding for a new expedition, and so 3 ships left for England in the spring of 1587. Among those on board was White's pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband. Now, that first colony didn't actually end with Francis Drake's evacuation. Just a few days after Drake had left Roanoke, another ship stocked with supplies arrived and found no sign of the colonists, including the 3 who'd been left behind. In an effort to re-establish the colony, the supply ship left 15 sailors on the island and then returned to England. John White wasn't planning to establish his new colony on Roanoke. He figured a place called Chesapeake Bay on the mainland would be far better, but he had been told of the 15 sailors on Roanoke, and he planned to stop and visit them before continuing on. On paper, John White was the leader of the expedition, but his navigator, Simon Fernandez, had far more sailing experience. Because of this, the crew actually trusted Fernandez much more in practice, and he actually served as the commander. For some reason that we still don't understand, Fernandez ignored the plan to land at Chesapeake Bay, and he ordered all of the colonists off of the ship at Roanoke Island. White never challenged his decision. So they reached the abandoned colony and were surprised to find no sign of the 15 crew members who had been dropped off there 1 year earlier. But White did find a pile of human bones just outside the village and concluded that the earlier group had been killed by natives some time ago. His suspicions were confirmed when, just a few days later, one of the new colonists named George Howe was shot and killed by 16 native arrows. White realized with a sickening feeling in his stomach that the English were no longer welcome on Roanoke. As the colonists continued to rebuild over the following months, they became more and more concerned over their long-term survival. Supplies were running low, and they urged White to return to England to fetch more provisions and then come back. White didn't want to leave. He felt like he would be abandoning his people, including his own pregnant daughter. But as the threat of starvation loomed on the horizon, he eventually made the very difficult decision to leave in August 1587. After a difficult voyage home, White returned to find England at war with Spain. Under the Queen's orders, no ship was allowed to leave England as they needed all the resources at home for the war effort. So White remained trapped in England for the next 3 long years. He could only pray that his friends and his daughter Eleanor were somehow staying alive in this hostile new world. In the spring of 1590, White was finally permitted to leave, and he quickly organized an expedition back to America. 3 months later, he approached Roanoke Island with anticipation and fired 2 cannon blasts to announce his return. White made his way back onto the island in a small rowboat. As he hiked towards the colony, he noticed something strange. He found 2 maple trees beside each other with carved letters in each of them. The first one read Crow, just the letters C-R-O in capitals, and the second one read Croatoan. As White approached the colony, his heart sank. Everything there was overgrown with grass and weeds. Houses were falling apart and had been stripped of all their valuables. It became very clear to him that nobody had lived there for a very long time. So where did all the colonists go? Most explanations start with the engravings found on the trees outside the abandoned village. In his journal, White explained that he had no doubt as to the meaning of these engravings, because before he had left 3 years earlier, he came to an agreement with the colonists. If they ever abandoned the village before he returned, they would leave behind some indication of their destination. If they were leaving in distress, they agreed to mark a cross beside the name of the location that they were moving to. Since there was no cross found on the tree, White assumed that the colonists had relocated to the nearby Croatoan Island, not under any distress, maybe just because that island seemed like a better place to set up camp. Just when White was preparing to move on to the Croatoan Island to investigate and hopefully reunite with his friends, his anchor cable snapped. Now, with no way to safely hold his ship near shore, he turned around and made his way back to England. On the trip back, White wanted to believe it was an open and shut case, and that even though he never saw his friends, they were all safely situated on Croatoan Island. The carvings on the tree seemed to make that clear, but there was one fact that was bothering him. Before White had left the original settlement on Roanoke to go back to England and fetch more provisions, the colonists had actually been preparing to make a move, but to the mainland, which was 50 miles west. They figured there it would be safer and also easier to grow food. Now, the Croatoan Island is 50 miles south and also an island, so why would they move there? White really had no idea. Over the next 20 years, John White moved out of the spotlight. He bought a quiet country estate and continued to build his career as a mapmaker. He never did make another trip across the Atlantic again, but as others continued to explore the New World, clues kept popping up as to the whereabouts of this lost colony. In 1607, the English founded the colony of Jamestown on the mainland amongst a large native population ruled by a man named Powhatan. Powhatan captured the well-known English explorer John Smith and actually told him about a place with men wearing European clothes. Later, when Smith was drawing a map of Virginia, he made a note that said, "Here remaineth 4 men clothed that came from Roanoke." The claim was never investigated, so we'll never know the truth behind this. There was a rumor floating around at that time that the Roanoke colonists had been massacred by Powhatan, but John White didn't find any human remains when he returned to the colony. Of course, the colonists could have moved to another location and been massacred there. In fact, Powhatan even admitted to having done this, yet John Smith made no mention of a massacre in his very detailed records of his expedition, so we don't really know if Powhatan was telling the truth. Nearly a century later, in 1701, an English explorer named John Lawson made contact with a native tribe called the Hatteras. The Hatteras occupied the Croatoan Island, a landmass that had actually become much larger in the last 100 years. When Lawson spoke to the Hatteras, they explained that some of their ancestors had been white and also able to read. He also noticed that members of the tribe had blue eyes, a trait that was particular to the Hatteras people. Nothing further was discovered until the late 1930s when a very strange artifact brought the mystery back to life. A set of stones was found inscribed with a message from Eleanor Dare, who was the daughter of John White and a member of the Roanoke Island colony. The stones tell a horrific story of disease, famine, and slaughter at the hands of the natives. While the authenticity of the stones has not been confirmed, they do appear to be quite old, as if they have been sitting outside for centuries. It's hard to imagine that someone back in the 1930s could have chemically aged the surface in order to fake this appearance. The next big breakthrough in the Roanoke Island mystery came in 2011. While examining John White's maps of Roanoke and the surrounding area, historians found a couple of patches in different locations. Back in the day, a patch on a map was usually used to conceal a small mistake. Underneath the first patch, as you might expect, the historians found a minor correction. But underneath the second patch was something far more interesting. There, they found a 4-point star, which at the time represented the location of a fort. The paint used to draw this star matched the rest of the map, so White had very clearly marked the location and then tried to conceal it. On top of the patch, they also found a smaller star, which was marked with invisible ink. Most interesting of all was the location of this star. It was 50 miles west of Roanoke, on the mainland, in the exact same spot that Eleanor Dare's stones were found. Excavation of the area has since revealed pottery and metal tools, which seem to indicate a European presence. So why would John White want to conceal the location of this supposed fort? Well, there's actually a pretty simple explanation for that. You'll remember that in the late 16th century, England was at war with Spain, so if one of John White's maps were to fall into Spanish hands, which frequently did happen at the time, the English wouldn't want their fort location to be known, since this could lead to a surprise attack. I suppose it could have just been a mistake too, but the invisible ink seems to indicate concealment rather than revision. Based on the evidence of the map, this is the most recent explanation of the disappearance of the Roanoke colony. After John White left in 1587 and was delayed due to the Spanish War, the colony split into 2 groups. One group traveled to the Croatoan Island, and the other went to the location of the supposed fort on the mainland. The move could have been motivated by famine or perhaps a drought. After the decision to leave Roanoke was finalized, there was likely some disagreement as to the best place to move, which resulted in a split amongst the colonists. While this does seem like a reasonable explanation, there are pieces of this story that we'll never know for sure. What happened to the 3 colonists who were left behind after Francis Drake's evacuation? Why did Simon Fernandez decide to land at Roanoke Island instead of Chesapeake Bay? And why was one of the carvings in the tree left unfinished? We'll never know the truth behind these questions, but That's what keeps things interesting. If we had an answer to every question of history, then there wouldn't be much to ponder, would there?